Steve stood at the edge of the old stone wall, his eyes scanning the small church nestled in the valley below. The simple structure belied the secrets it held within, and the whispers of magic that clung to its ancient stones were almost palpable to those attuned to such things. Steve's sister, Carla, stood beside him, her expression one of mild irritation mixed with curiosity. "Are you sure this is the place?" Carla asked, crossing her arms as she squinted at the church. "It doesn't exactly scream hidden lair of evil." Steve nodded, his gaze never leaving the building. "Positive. I can feel the lingering magic in the air. The stench of whatever dark rituals were performed here is unmistakable." Carla sighed, rolling her eyes. "Great. Just what we need. More dark rituals. You know, there are easier ways to spend our time than poking around cursed grounds." Steve turned to his sister, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Since when did you shy away from a little danger? Besides, it's not just about the magic. This place is connected to something much bigger. If we can figure out what's going on here, we might be able to turn the tide in our favor." Fine, Carla relented, waving a hand dismissively. "But if something jumps out at us, I'm blaming you." The two siblings made their way down the hill, moving swiftly and silently. As they approached the church, Steve held up a hand, signaling Carla to stop. He knelt down, tracing his fingers along the ground. "Ward stones. We'll need to disarm them before we can get any closer." Carla crouched beside him, frowning. "This is Quarry's work. She's an expert with these kinds of defenses. Are you sure we can take them down without alerting her?" Steve nodded, already reaching into his bag for the tools he would need. "It won't be easy, but it's possible. Just keep an eye out for anything unusual while I work." Minutes passed in tense silence as Steve carefully dismantled the first set of ward stones. You could feel the magic thrumming beneath his fingers, the intricate web of spells designed to alert anyone who dared to tamper with them. But he was a master in his own right, and slowly but surely the wards fell. "Done," he whispered, standing up and dusting off his hands. "That's the first line of defense down. Let's move." They slipped through the gate, their steps muffled by the thick layer of moss that covered the ground. The church loomed before them, its stone walls weathered by time and elements. Steve could hear the faint hum of the next set of wards, this time embedded high along the roofline. "Spread out," Steve instructed. "We need to take these down quickly and quietly. If Quarry is nearby, we don't want to give her time to respond." Carla nodded and moved to the opposite side of the building, her eyes scanning the stonework for any signs of hidden traps. Steve began working on the wards, his concentration absolute. The magic resisted his efforts at first, but with patience and skill, he began to unravel it. As the last ward fell, a sudden chill ran down Steve's spine. He straightened up, eyes narrowing as he sensed a shift in the air. "Something's wrong," he murmured. Carla returned to his side, her expression grim. "You feel it too. It's like the whole place just woke up." Before Steve could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The ancient stones of the church groaned and creaked, as if some long-forgotten force was stirring to life. A low, ominous chant echoed from within the church, and the air grew thick with the scent of burning incense and something far more foul. Steve exchanged a look with Carla. "We need to get inside and stop whatever's happening." "Agreed," Carla said, drawing her sword. "But let's not be stupid about this. We go in fast, we take out anything that moves, and we get out. No heroics." Steve grinned. "When have I ever been heroic?" Carla snorted. "You've always had a death wish, little brother. Let's just hope it doesn't come true today." With that, the two of them moved toward the church doors. As they approached, the chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and the door itself seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Steve could feel the magic intensifying, the air practically crackling with power. "This is it," Steve said, placing his hand on the door. "Ready?" "Always," Carla replied, tightening her grip on her sword. Steve pushed the door open, and they stepped into the darkened interior of the church. The air inside was thick with smoke and the sickly sweet scent of decay. Shadows danced along the walls, and at the far end of the room, a group of hooded figures stood in a circle, their voices rising and falling in a twisted harmony. In the center of the circle, an altar made of black stone pulsed with a sickly green light. Steve's eyes widened as he recognized the symbols carved into the stone, symbols of an ancient and malevolent force that had been sealed away centuries ago. "We need to stop them," Steve hissed, already gathering his magic. "If they finish that ritual, we're all in deep trouble." Carla nodded, her expression hardening. "Then let's do this." Without another word, they charged forward, their movements swift and precise. The hooded figures barely had time to react before Carla's sword cut through the first of them, sending a spray of dark blood across the altar. Steve unleashed a blast of energy, scattering the remaining figures and disrupting the ritual. The air crackled with power as the ritual collapsed in on itself, the green light flickering and fading. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the hooded figures let out a final despairing wail before they crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Steve and Carla stood panting, their weapons still at the ready as they scanned the room for any remaining threats. But the church was silent once more, the oppressive energy that had filled it dissipating like mist in the morning sun. "We did it," Carla said, a note of disbelief in her voice. Steve nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. "Yeah, but we need to make sure this place is cleansed. We can't leave any trace of that ritual behind." "Agreed," Carla said, wiping her blade clean. "Let's get to work." As they began the process of purifying the church, Steve couldn't help but glance back at the altar. The dark stone lay silent now, its power broken. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that this was only the beginning. The forces they had disrupted here were ancient and powerful, and they would not be so easily defeated. For now, though, they had won. And as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, Steve allowed himself a moment of relief. But only a moment. The battle was far from over. Steve led the group through the church grounds, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. The tension was palpable as they approached the old stone building. It was an unassuming structure, yet its aura of latent power was unmistakable. The smell of damp earth and ancient wood filled the air, mixed with the faint metallic tang of blood from old battles. The church stood silent, a sentinel from a forgotten era, guarding secrets long buried. As they neared the entrance, Steve held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. He closed his eyes and muttered an incantation under his breath, his fingers tracing symbols in the air. The symbols glowed faintly before disappearing, leaving a soft shimmer in their wake. After a moment, Steve nodded, satisfied. "The wards are down. We've got a clear path," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the wind through the trees. Fanina, her eyes darting around nervously, gripped her sword tighter. "Are you sure? I mean, it's too quiet." Steve chuckled softly. "Of course it's quiet. We just neutralized the alarms. The church's defenses are strong, but they're not invincible. Now, keep your wits about you. This place might hold more surprises than we expect." Larry, the dwarf, grumbled under his breath. "I still don't like this. Desecrate in a church, even one dedicated to a rival god, doesn't sit right with me." "Relax," Steve said, patting the dwarf on the back. "It's all part of the job. Besides, it's not like we're here to steal or destroy. We're just redistributing some holy relics." The group shared uneasy glances as they stepped inside. The church's interior was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering candles placed at the altar. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by their intrusion. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries depicting ancient battles and the gods' triumphs, their colors dulled by time. Steve moved with purpose, his steps echoing in the empty space. He approached the altar and began to examine it closely, his hands running over the carved stone surface. "There's something here," he murmured, more to himself than the others. "Fanina," standing guard near the entrance, glanced back at him. "What do you mean?" "An enchantment," Steve replied, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the intricate patterns etched into the stone. "It's old, powerful, but there's a flaw. If I can just—" Before he could finish, the ground beneath them rumbled, and a low growl reverberated through the church. The candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Steve, what did you do?" Sherry, the half-demon, asked, her hand instinctively reaching for her dagger. "I may have triggered something," Steve admitted, stepping back from the altar as the growl grew louder. From the shadows, a massive stone golem emerged, its eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. It moved with surprising speed for something so large, its footsteps shaking the ground. The golem's stone fists were the size of boulders, and its presence radiated raw power. "Well, that's new," Steve muttered, drawing his staff. "I didn't expect a guardian like this." "That's what you get for messing with ancient magic," Larry shouted, already preparing a defensive spell. The golem let out a deafening roar, raising one of its massive fists to strike. The group scattered, narrowly avoiding the crushing blow as the fist slammed into the ground, sending shards of stone flying in all directions. "Steve, any ideas?" Fanina called out, dodging another swing from the golem. "Working on it," Steve replied, frantically flipping through the pages of his spellbook. "This thing's magic is complicated. It's like a puzzle, but one wrong move and—" "We get squashed," Larry finished, hurling a bolt of lightning at the golem. The spell struck the creature's chest, but it barely flinched, its stone skin absorbing the impact. "Right," Steve said, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. "We need to find a way to weaken it. Keep it distracted while I figure this out." Sherry moved swiftly, her demon-enhanced reflexes allowing her to stay one step ahead of the golem's attacks. She slashed at the creature's legs with her dagger, the enchanted blade leaving deep gashes in the stone. But still, the golem pressed on, relentless in its pursuit. Fanina leaped onto the golem's back, driving her sword into its neck. The blade sank in, but the golem showed no sign of pain, merely shaking her off like a minor annoyance. Steve's mind raced as he analyzed the golem's magic. There was a pattern, a sequence of runes that controlled its movements. If he could just disrupt the sequence. "Got it," Steve shouted, his eyes lighting up with realization. He began chanting an incantation, his hands moving in a precise rhythm. The air around him shimmered with magical energy. The golem, sensing the shift in power, turned its attention to Steve, its glowing eyes narrowing. It raised both fists, preparing to crush the sorcerer in a single blow. "Keep it off me for just a few more seconds," Steve yelled, his voice strained as he maintained the spell. Larry, Fanina, and Sherry threw everything they had at the golem, trying to buy Steve the time he needed. Lightning, steel, and shadow magic all collided with the golem's stone body, chipping away at its defenses. Finally, Steve completed the spell, and a wave of energy pulsed through the church, striking the golem directly in its core. The creature froze, its movements suddenly sluggish and disjointed. Cracks began to spread across its body, and with a final earth-shaking roar, the golem crumbled to the ground, reduced to nothing more than a pile of rubble. The group stood in silence for a moment, catching their breath as the dust settled. Steve wiped the sweat from his brow and grinned. "Well, that was fun." "Fun," Larry echoed, shaking his head. "You and I have very different definitions of fun." Sherry sheathed her dagger, her eyes scanning the room for any more threats. "Is it over?" "For now," Steve said, stepping over the rubble and back to the altar. "But we still have a job to do. The real prize is hidden somewhere in this church, and we're not leaving until we find it." As the group regrouped, Steve's eyes were drawn to a small, inconspicuous stone at the base of the altar. It was different from the others, almost out of place. He knelt down and carefully pried it loose, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. Inside was a small, ornate box, its surface covered in intricate carvings and glowing faintly with a soft blue light. Steve's grin widened as he carefully lifted the box out of the compartment. "This," he said, holding the box up for the others to see, "is what we came for." Fanina peered at the box, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "Something very old and very powerful," Steve replied, his voice filled with a mix of awe and excitement. "And now it's ours." But as they prepared to leave, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance. The group tensed, readying their weapons as they turned to face the new threat. Steve's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, holding the box close to his chest. "Who's there?" From the shadows, a figure emerged, cloaked in darkness. The figure's voice was cold. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a tall, imposing figure clad in dark armor that seemed to absorb the faint candlelight. A deep hood obscured the stranger's face, but the glint of steel beneath it hinted at a warrior with deadly intent. The air grew colder, and a palpable sense of dread filled the room. Steve stood his ground, the box still clutched in his hand. "And who might your master be?" he asked, trying to buy time as his mind raced to formulate a plan. The armored figure's voice was deep and resonant, carrying the weight of countless battles. "My master's name is not for the likes of you to know, sorcerer, but you will know his wrath if you do not return what you have stolen." Larry gripped his warhammer, his muscles tensing as he prepared for a fight. "We didn't come this far to hand over our prize to some lackey. If your master wants it, he'll have to come get it himself." The figure took a step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. "Brave words, dwarf, but your courage will only take you so far. I am not here to negotiate. I am here to enforce my master's will." Fanina moved closer to Steve, her eyes never leaving the armored figure. "Steve, what's in the box? Is it worth risking our lives for?" Steve's eyes flicked to the box in his hands. The intricate carvings on its surface seemed to pulse with energy, as if the object inside was alive. "This is more than just a trinket, Fanina. It's a relic of immense power, something that could tip the balance in our favor. But it's also dangerous in the wrong hands." Sherry, standing at Steve's side, glanced at him with concern. "Then maybe we should consider handing it over. If this guy is as powerful as he seems, we might be in over our heads." The figure's voice cut through their conversation like a knife. "You are outmatched, outnumbered, and out of time. Surrender the box, and you may yet live to see another day." Steve met the figure's gaze, or at least where he imagined the figure's eyes would be beneath the hood. "And what guarantee do we have that you'll let us walk away? We've faced plenty of threats before, and we've survived. What makes you so sure we can't take you down?" The armored figure let out a low, menacing chuckle. "Because you've never faced anything like me, but I am not without mercy. Return the box, and I will allow you to leave this place unharmed. Refuse, and I will show you the true meaning of despair." Larry's grip tightened on his hammer, his knuckles white with the effort. "I've had enough of your threats, lad. If you want the box, you'll have to take it from us by force." With a roar of defiance, Larry charged at the figure, his warhammer crackling with magical energy. The ground shook with each step as the dwarf closed the distance, his weapon raised high for a crushing blow. But before Larry could strike, the figure moved with blinding speed, sidestepping the attack with a grace that belied his massive armor. In one swift motion, the figure drew a long, wickedly curved sword, the blade gleaming with a dark, ethereal light. Larry barely had time to react as the figure's sword slashed through the air, aiming for his neck. But at the last moment, Fanina intercepted the blow, her own sword clashing against the dark blade with a shower of sparks. The force of the impact sent her staggering back, but she quickly regained her footing, her eyes blazing with determination. "You're not taking him down that easily," Fanina growled, her voice laced with defiance. The figure regarded her with cold indifference. "Foolish girl, you are merely delaying the inevitable." Steve, realizing they were outmatched in a direct confrontation, began chanting a spell under his breath. The words of power resonated in the air, causing the candles to flare up as he drew on the ambient magic in the church. He could feel the box in his hands growing warmer, as if responding to the surge of energy. "Sherry, Larry, Fanina, buy me some time," Steve shouted, his voice strained as he focused on the complex spellwork. Larry, undeterred by the failed attack, swung his warhammer with renewed vigor, aiming for the figure's legs. Sherry darted around the room, using her agility to distract the enemy with quick, precise strikes, her daggers glinting in the dim light. Fanina held her ground, parrying the figure's powerful blows, each clash of steel echoing through the church. But despite their combined efforts, it was clear that the figure was toying with them. His movements were fluid, almost effortless, as he deflected their attacks with ease. The dark energy that surrounded him seemed to sap the strength from their limbs, making each swing of their weapons feel heavier than the last. As Steve's spell neared completion, he could feel the magic building to a crescendo. The air crackled with energy, and the ground beneath him began to tremble. But just as he was about to unleash the spell, the figure's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Enough." With a single word, the figure unleashed a wave of dark energy that rippled through the church, sending the group flying backward. Steve's spell fizzled out, the energy dissipating into the air as he was thrown against the wall. He gasped in pain, struggling to catch his breath as the box slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. The figure strode forward, his presence dominating the room. He bent down and picked up the box, cradling it in his armored hands as if it were a precious treasure. "This relic does not belong to you," he said, his voice cold and final. "It never did." Steve, bruised and battered, managed to push himself up to his knees. What are you going to do with it?" The figure paused, considering the question. "What my master wills. You cannot comprehend the forces at play here, sorcerer. But rest assured, this relic's power will be used as it was always meant to be." Larry, groaning in pain, forced himself to stand, his determination undimmed. "You think we're just gonna let you walk away with that?" The figure turned to face him, the dark sword still in hand. "You are brave, dwarf, but foolish. You've already lost. Do not compound your defeat with more pointless resistance." Fanina, clutching her side where she had been thrown, looked at Steve with a mix of desperation and resolve. "Steve, do we have a plan?" Steve wiped blood from the corner of his mouth, his mind racing. They were out of options, outmatched, and out of time. But surrendering wasn't in his nature. There had to be something they could do, some way to turn the tide. Then it came to him, a desperate, risky plan, but it was all they had left. "Listen to me," Steve said, his voice urgent. "We can't beat him in a straight fight, but maybe we don't have to. If we can disrupt the magic binding the box to him, we might be able to break his connection to it." Sherry looked at Steve, her eyes narrowing. "You mean, sever his link to the relic?" "Exactly," Steve said, nodding. "But it's going to take everything we've got. Are you with me?" The group exchanged glances, each of them battered and exhausted, but none of them willing to back down. "Let's do it," Larry grunted, gripping his warhammer with renewed resolve. "Whatever it takes," Fanina agreed, her voice firm despite the pain. Sherry simply nodded, her expression determined. Steve took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "All right, on my signal, we're going to hit him with everything we've got." As the figure turned to leave, Steve began chanting again, this time focusing all of his energy on the box itself. He could feel the magic inside it, ancient and powerful, resonating with his own. He reached out, trying to form a connection with the relic, to understand its nature. The figure paused, sensing the shift in the air. He turned back, his eyes narrowing beneath the hood. "What are you doing?" "Now," Steve shouted. Larry, Fanina, and Sherry unleashed a barrage of attacks, each of them pouring their remaining strength into the assault. Lightning crackled, steel clashed, and shadowy magic enveloped the figure, forcing him to defend himself. Steve focused on the box, channeling all of his energy into it. He could feel the dark magic binding it to the figure, a web of intricate spells and runes. It was complex, ancient, but not unbreakable. With a final surge of power, Steve directed his magic at the binding spell, unraveling it with a single decisive strike. The figure let out a roar of anger as the connection was severed. The box slipped from his grasp, the glow fading as it fell to the ground. He staggered back, momentarily disoriented. Larry seized the opportunity, charging forward with a battle cry. His warhammer struck the figure's chest with all the force he could muster, sending the armored foe crashing to the ground. "Steve, now," Vanina shouted, her sword at the ready. Steve didn't hesitate. He reached for the box, the last remnants of his strength focused on one final spell. He whispered the incantation, and the box began to glow once more, but this time with a pure, radiant light. The figure, struggling to rise, let out a howl of rage. "You fools, you have no idea what you've done." But it was too late. The spell was complete, and the box's power surged through the church, driving out the darkness that had threatened to consume them. The figure's form wavered, the dark energy dissipating as the relic's light filled the room. With a final defiant snarl, the figure vanished, leaving only the echo of his voice behind. "You will pay for this, sorcerer. My master will not forget." The group stood in silence, the only sound the ragged breathing of the exhausted adventurers. The church, once a place of fear and darkness, now felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. Steve sank to his knees, the box still glowing faintly in his hands. He looked up at his companions, a weary smile on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. "We actually did it." Vanina sheathed her sword, walking over to Steve. "You're not going to tell us you planned all of that, are you?" Steve chuckled weakly. "Let's just say it was a team effort." Larry, his warhammer slung over his shoulder, grinned. "Aye, that it was. But we ain't out of the woods yet. We need to figure out what to do with that thing before more of his kind come looking for it." Sherry, ever practical, nodded. "And we need to get out of here. We've drawn enough attention as it is." Steve stood, cradling the box carefully. "Agreed. But first, let's make sure this relic ends up in the right hands. Whatever power it holds, we can't let it fall into the wrong ones." With that, the group made their way out of the church, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees as they emerged into the morning light. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. And as they set off on the next leg of their journey, they knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The journey away from the desecrated church was arduous, with each step feeling heavier than the last. Steve clutched the relic tightly, the weight of its significance pressing down on him. The morning sun cast long shadows on the forest path, but despite the daylight, the group couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. They were exhausted, their wounds still fresh, but there was no time to rest. The threat of pursuit loomed over them like a dark cloud. Larry trudged along, his warhammer slung over his shoulder, casting wary glances back at the path they had just traversed. "We need to find a place to lay low, regroup, and figure out our next move. That figure's master won't let this slide." Vanina, walking beside Steve, nodded in agreement. He was too powerful to be just another servant. Whoever he works for must be a force to be reckoned with. We need to be smart about this. Sherry moved with practiced stealth, her senses on high alert as she scouted ahead. "There's a village a few miles from here. We can rest there, but we'll need to be cautious. We don't know who might be watching." Steve's thoughts raced as they continued down the path. The relic in his hands was more than just a source of power. It was a key, a catalyst for something far greater. The magic within it was ancient, and its purpose was shrouded in mystery. But one thing was clear: it was dangerous, and it had already attracted the attention of powerful enemies. As they approached the village, Steve considered their options. They needed to learn more about the relic and its history. There were too many unknowns, and ignorance could get them killed. "We'll need information, and fast," Steve said, breaking the silence. "There's got to be someone in the village who knows about artifacts like this. We'll need to ask around, but discreetly." The village came into view, a small cluster of thatched roof houses nestled in a valley. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of distant voices carried on the breeze. It was a peaceful place, seemingly untouched by the turmoil that plagued the lands beyond. As they entered the village, the group garnered a few curious glances from the locals, but most people seemed too absorbed in their daily tasks to pay them much mind. They made their way to the village inn, a modest building with a sign depicting a fox and a pheasant in mid-hunt. The innkeeper, a stout man with a friendly demeanor, greeted them with a welcoming smile. "Welcome to the Fox and Pheasant," the innkeeper said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You look like you've seen better days. What can I do for you?" Steve stepped forward, trying to appear as casual as possible. "Just looking for a place to rest for a while. We've been on the road for quite some time." The innkeeper nodded, gesturing to the empty tables. "You've come to the right place. We've got rooms available, and I can have some food brought out if you're hungry. Name's Gerald, by the way." "Much appreciated, Gerald," Larry said, setting his warhammer down by the door. "And a round of ale wouldn't go amiss either." Gerald chuckled, nodding as he made his way to the back. "Coming right up." As they settled into a corner table, Sherry kept an eye on the door, her instincts still on high alert. Vanina leaned in closer to Steve, her voice low. "We should ask around, see if anyone knows about ancient relics or the church we were just at. But we have to be careful. We don't want to attract the wrong kind of attention." Steve agreed, though he knew that being subtle wasn't their strong suit. "Let's start by asking Gerald. He might know something or at least point us in the right direction." When Gerald returned with their drinks and a platter of food, Steve engaged him in conversation. "This village seems like a quiet place. Not much trouble around here, I hope." Gerald shrugged, setting the drinks down. "It's quiet enough, most days. We get the occasional traveler passing through, but nothing out of the ordinary. Though, if it's trouble you're looking to avoid, you're in the right place. Folks around here keep to themselves." Larry took a long swig of his ale, then set the mug down with a satisfied sigh. "Ever hear of any strange happenings in the area? Old ruins, haunted places, that sort of thing?" Gerald raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. "You're not the first to ask about such things. There's an old legend about a ruined church deep in the woods. People say it's cursed, that it was once a place of dark rituals. But that's just stories, mind you. Superstitions from the old days." Steve exchanged a glance with Vanina. "And what about artifacts? Anything special ever found in those ruins?" Gerald hesitated, clearly sensing there was more to their questions than idle curiosity. "I wouldn't know much about that, but if you're interested in old relics and the like, there's a scholar who lives near the edge of the village. Name's Elara. She's a bit eccentric, but she knows a lot about ancient history and magic. Might be worth talking to her." "Thanks, Gerald," Steve said, slipping a few coins into the innkeeper's hand. "We appreciate the help." After finishing their meal, the group made their way to Elara's home, a small cottage on the outskirts of the village. The cottage was surrounded by a garden filled with herbs and flowers, and a faint smell of incense lingered in the air. Steve knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal a woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes. She wore a simple robe, and a necklace with a crystal pendant hung around her neck. "Yes?" Elara asked, her voice soft but commanding. "Are you Elara?" Steve asked. "We were told you might be able to help us with some questions about ancient relics and the history of this area." Elara studied them for a moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside to let them enter. The inside of the cottage was cozy, filled with bookshelves, strange artifacts, and the warm glow of candlelight. Ilara motioned for them to sit at a wooden table in the center of the room. So, Ilara began, sitting across from them. What exactly are you looking for? Steve placed the box on the table, carefully unwrapping it to reveal the relic inside. The moment Ilara saw it, her eyes widened with recognition. "Where'd you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the ruins of an old church deep in the forest," Steve explained. "We were ambushed by a powerful figure who claimed it for his master. We barely escaped with it, but we have no idea what we're dealing with." Ilara reached out, her fingers hovering just above the relic, as if she were afraid to touch it. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and awe. This is no ordinary artifact," she murmured, her voice tinged with reverence. "It is a conduit, a vessel for immense power. The church you found it in was not just any ruin. It was once a place where powerful sorcerers gathered, long before it was desecrated. They performed rituals, binding magic to objects like this one." Steve leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What kind of power? What does it do?" Ilara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the relic. "It is said that these conduits can channel the very essence of the land itself. They were created to control the forces of nature, to command the elements, and even to manipulate life and death. But such power comes at a cost. The magic within these relics is ancient and unpredictable. It can corrupt, twist the mind of the wielder, and unleash forces beyond their control." Fanina's eyes narrowed with concern. So the figure who attacked us, he wanted this power for himself or his master. But why? What's their endgame? Ilara looked up, her expression grave. "There are those who seek to harness the power of these conduits to reshape the world in their image. To bring about a new order, one where they hold dominion over all. If this figure serves such a master, then you're dealing with someone who will stop at nothing to get what they want. The fact that you have this relic means you are now part of a much larger conflict." Larry grunted, his hand tightening around the handle of his warhammer. "We've faced powerful enemies before, but this feels different. We can't just keep running. We need to figure out how to use this thing, or at least how to stop it from falling into the wrong hands." Sherry, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "What about destroying it? If it's too dangerous, maybe the safest option is to make sure no one can use it." Ilara shook her head slowly. "Destroying the conduit is no simple task. The magic within it is bound to the very fabric of the world. To destroy it would require an immense amount of power that could easily backfire. And even if you succeeded, the backlash could be catastrophic." Steve's mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. "So, we're stuck with it. We can't use it without risking corruption, and we can't destroy it without causing more harm. What are we supposed to do?" Ilara leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "There might be another way. There are ancient texts, hidden away in the archives of the Order of the Eternal Flame, that speak of rituals to safely contain and neutralize conduits. If you could find those texts, you might have a chance at sealing the relic's power, or at least containing it until a permanent solution can be found." Larry raised an eyebrow. "The Order of the Eternal Flame. I've heard of them. They're not exactly the friendly type. Getting those texts won't be easy." Ilara nodded in agreement. "The Order is secretive, and they guard their knowledge fiercely. But if you can prove that you mean to keep the world safe, they might be willing to help. You'll need to approach them carefully. Show them that you're not a threat, and that you're committed to stopping those who would misuse the relic." Fanina looked around at the group, her eyes filled with determination. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now. If the Order has the knowledge we need, then we'll find a way to get it." Steve felt a surge of resolve. They had faced countless dangers together, and this was no different. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but they had a purpose now, a goal to strive for. "Then it's settled. We'll make our way to the Order's stronghold and find those texts. We'll figure out how to contain this relic and stop whoever's after it." Elara stood, her expression one of quiet respect. I wish you luck on your journey. You're walking a dangerous path, but you're not alone. If you ever need guidance, you're welcome to return here. I'll do all I can to help. Thank you, Elara, Steve said, his voice sincere. We won't forget your kindness. As they left Elara's cottage, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the village. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with hues of orange and pink. Despite the beauty of the evening, the group felt the weight of their mission heavy on their shoulders. Sherry led the way, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings as they made their way back to the inn. We should rest for the night and head out at first light. The sooner we reach the Order, the better. Larry nodded in agreement, though his expression was tense. Yeah, but we need to be careful. We don't know who else might be looking for us. That figure and his master won't just sit idle while we make our move. Steve looked down at the relic in his hands, its surface glimmering faintly in the fading light. We'll stay vigilant. We faced tough odds before, and we've come out on top. We can do this. As they returned to the inn, the group settled in for the night, each member lost in their thoughts. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but they were united in their purpose. The relic was a powerful weapon, but it was also a grave responsibility. They would need to use every ounce of their strength, wisdom, and courage to see this through. In the quiet darkness of his room, Steve sat by the window, gazing out at the night sky. The stars twinkled above, distant and indifferent to the struggles of those below, but Steve didn't feel alone. He had his friends, his comrades, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. As sleep finally claimed him, Steve's last thought was a simple one. They would prevail. No matter the cost, they would find a way to protect their world from the darkness that threatened it. And in the end, they would prove that even in the face of overwhelming power, humanity's will to survive and protect what they held dear would never be extinguished. The first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of the inn, gently waking the group from their uneasy slumber. Steve rose from his bed, the weight of the mission ahead heavy on his shoulders. He dressed quickly, his mind already racing through their plans. The journey to the Order of the Eternal Flame was fraught with uncertainty, and they had to be prepared for anything. Downstairs in the common room, the smell of freshly baked bread and brewing coffee filled the air. The innkeeper, a stout woman with a warm smile, served them breakfast with a nod of encouragement. You're heading out early, I see. Good luck with your journey. The road to the Order's stronghold can be treacherous. Steve thanked her and gathered his companions. Fanina and Larry were already at the table, discussing their strategy, while Sherry was going over their supplies, ensuring they had everything they might need. The sense of urgency was palpable, but so was their determination. All set, Steve asked, looking around at his friends. Just about, Sherry replied, her eyes scanning their gear. We've got enough provisions for a few days and some basic supplies for protection. We should be fine as long as we stay on our toes. Larry nodded, tightening the straps on his Warhammer's harness. We need to be ready for anything. The Order won't be easy to get to, and we have no idea what kind of defenses they might have. We should keep a low profile and avoid unnecessary confrontations. Fanina finished her meal and stood, her gaze steady. We've faced challenges before, and we've overcome them. This is just another obstacle in our path. Let's stay focused and push forward. With their preparations complete, the group set out from the village, the early morning sun casting long shadows on the ground. The path to the Order's stronghold was said to be treacherous, winding through dense forests and rugged terrain. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife. As they traveled, the dense forest canopy provided a sense of isolation, making them feel as if they were stepping into a world apart from the one they knew. The path was narrow and winding, and they had to be cautious of the uneven ground and hidden roots. After several hours of travel, they reached a small clearing where they decided to rest. They sat on a fallen log, their eyes scanning the surrounding forest for any signs of danger. We're making good progress, Steve said, looking at the map they had been using. If we keep this pace, we should reach the Order's stronghold by tomorrow evening. Sherry, ever the cautious one, frowned. We should be on the lookout for any scouts or patrols. The Order is known to be secretive and protective of their domain. We don't want to be caught off guard. Fanina nodded in agreement. I'll take first watch. You all rest up. We need to be sharp for whatever might come our way. As the group took turns resting and keeping watch, the forest around them seemed to grow quieter, the natural sounds of the wildlife fading into an eerie silence. The stillness was unsettling, but they pressed on, knowing that the path ahead was filled with challenges. As the sun began to set, they reached the base of a steep hill that marked the final stretch of their journey. The dense forest cleared to reveal a grand structure in the distance, an imposing fortress built into the side of a mountain, its towers reaching high into the sky. The Order of the Eternal Flame's stronghold was even more magnificent than Steve had imagined. The fortress was surrounded by a high stone wall, with watchtowers at regular intervals. The gates were made of heavy iron, and the entire structure seemed to radiate an aura of both ancient power and impenetrable security. We made it, Steve said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and apprehension. Now, we need to figure out how to get inside without drawing attention. Larry glanced at the fortress, his expression serious. We need to find a way in that won't attract the Order's attention. There must be an entrance that's not so heavily guarded. Sherry scanned the area, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. There's a narrow path leading around the side of the fortress. It might be a service entrance or a hidden passage. Fanina nodded, pointing toward the path. Let's check it out. We'll need to be extremely cautious. If we're spotted, it could jeopardize our entire mission. The group moved stealthily along the path, their senses alert for any sign of danger. The path led them to a smaller, less conspicuous door set into the side of the fortress wall. It was partially hidden by foliage and seemed less fortified than the main gates. Steve approached the door cautiously and tried the handle. To his surprise, it turned easily, and the door creaked open to reveal a dimly lit corridor beyond. Looks like our best bet, Steve whispered, motioning for the others to follow. They slipped through the door and into the corridor, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. The corridor was narrow and lined with old tapestries depicting scenes of ancient battles and mystical symbols. The air was cool and musty, and the faint scent of incense lingered. As they made their way deeper into the fortress, they encountered a series of winding passageways and staircases, each turn revealing more of the fortress's grandeur. The walls were adorned with intricate carvings and precious artifacts, a testament to the Order's long history and its dedication to the arcane arts. After what seemed like hours of navigating through the labyrinthine corridors, they finally arrived at a large chamber, its high ceilings supported by massive columns. The chamber was filled with shelves of ancient tomes and scrolls, and a large ornate desk stood in the center, covered in open books and scattered papers. Steve's heart raced with anticipation. This must be one of the Order's archives. They had to find the texts Ilara had mentioned. Start looking for anything that might be related to conduits or ancient rituals, Steve instructed, as he and his companions began to search through the piles of books and scrolls. The task was daunting. The texts were written in a variety of languages and scripts, many of which were unfamiliar to them. Sherry's expertise in ancient languages proved invaluable, as she translated passages and identified relevant information. Hours passed as they sifted through the materials, their progress slow but steady. The weight of their mission hung heavily on their shoulders, but they were determined to find the information they needed. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the narrow windows of the chamber, Sherry let out a triumphant cry. "I think I found something." Steve hurried over to where she was working. Sherry held up an ancient tome with a worn leather cover. The title was embossed in gold letters, partially faded but still readable. Rituals of Containment and Neutralization. "This is it," Steve said, a sense of relief washing over him. This book should contain the information we need to deal with the relic. As they gathered around the tome, their spirits lifted with renewed hope. They had taken a significant step forward in their mission. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but they had found a crucial piece of the puzzle. With the book in hand, the group prepared to leave the archives. Their mission was far from over, but they had gained valuable knowledge that would aid them in their quest to protect their world from the forces that sought to misuse the relic's power. As they made their way back through the corridors of the fortress, the weight of their responsibility was evident in their determined expressions. The journey to the Order's stronghold had been challenging, but their resolve was unshaken. The path ahead was uncertain, but with the ancient tome in their possession, they were one step closer to achieving their goal. The fight to protect their world was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever lay ahead with courage and determination. The sun had fully risen by the time Steve and his companions emerged from the labyrinthine corridors of the Order of the Eternal Flames fortress. With the ancient tomes safely secured in their possession, they were eager to make their way back to the village and continue their quest to neutralize the malevolent relic. However, their journey was far from over, and the fortress held many more secrets yet to be uncovered. The narrow path they had used to enter the fortress seemed less foreboding in the daylight. The towering walls and watchtowers loomed overhead, but the danger of being detected was lessened by their careful approach. As they retraced their steps through the dense forest, the feeling of being watched seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet resolve. "We need to be cautious," Steve said as they walked, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "The Order might have noticed our presence, and we could still encounter trouble on the way back." Larry, ever vigilant, kept a sharp lookout for any signs of pursuit. "Agreed. Let's stick together and move quickly. We can't afford any more delays." As they navigated the forest path, they shared their findings from the ancient tome. Sherry had already started deciphering parts of it, revealing crucial details about the rituals required to contain and neutralize the relic's power. The book describes a ritual that involves the use of specific arcane symbols and a series of precise steps, Sherry explained. "We'll need to gather some additional components, but we have most of what's needed already." Fanina, her expression focused, nodded. "We'll need to prepare everything carefully. One mistake could mean disaster. The ritual has to be performed exactly as described." The group pressed on, determined to reach the village before nightfall. As they neared their destination, they could see the village's familiar outline in the distance. The sight brought a sense of relief, knowing that they were close to completing this critical stage of their mission. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by the villagers, who were eager to hear about their journey. Steve quickly reassured them. "We've gathered the necessary information and will be preparing for the ritual to neutralize the relic." Ilara, who had been anxiously waiting for their return, approached with a mix of hope and concern. "How did it go? Did you find what you were looking for?" Sherry stepped forward, holding up the ancient tome. "We found the information we need. It's a complex ritual, but with the right preparation, we can perform it successfully." Ilara's eyes brightened with relief. "That's wonderful news. We've been preparing for this moment. The village is ready to support you in any way we can." The villagers rallied to help, offering their support and resources. The mood in the village was one of cautious optimism, knowing that the outcome of the ritual could determine their fate. The preparation for the ritual was meticulous, as every detail had to be attended to with precision. As night fell, the group gathered in the village's central square, where a large ceremonial circle had been prepared. The circle was inscribed with the ancient symbols described in the tome, and the necessary components for the ritual were arranged in their proper places. Steve, Sherry, Fanina, and Larry stood at the ready, each taking their designated positions within the circle. Ilara and other villagers watched with bated breath, their hope and trust in the group's success evident. Sherry opened the ancient tome, her voice steady as she began to recite the incantations. The symbols on the ground glowed faintly as the ritual commenced, the air around them charged with arcane energy. The precision of their movements and the clarity of their voices were crucial to the success of the ritual. Vanina and Larry followed Sherry's lead, performing their parts of the ritual with practiced skill. The energy in the circle intensified, and the symbols began to emit a bright, radiant light. The relic, which had been carefully placed at the center of the circle, started to resonate with the magical energy. As the ritual progressed, Steve remained focused, his thoughts steady and his actions deliberate. The ancient Tom had provided them with the necessary knowledge, but their success relied on their ability to execute the ritual flawlessly. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they completed the ritual's final steps. The light from the circle reached a crescendo, and the relic began to glow with a brilliant, almost blinding light. The power within the relic was being contained and neutralized, its malevolent influence dissipating. Finally, the light began to fade, and the energy in the circle settled. The relic was now surrounded by a protective aura, its dark power subdued. The ritual had been a success. Steve and his companions exhaled, their relief palpable. The villagers erupted in cheers, their gratitude and joy evident. Ilara approached with a look of profound relief. "You did it," Ilara said, her voice filled with awe. "The relic is contained. You've saved us all." Steve smiled, the weight of their accomplishments settling in. It was a team effort. We couldn't have done it without everyone's support. The village celebrated their victory that night, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that their world was safe from the relic's dark influence. The group of friends, wary but victorious, knew that their journey had come to a successful conclusion. As they sat around a fire, sharing stories and laughter, they reflected on the challenges they had faced and the strength they had drawn from one another. Their bond had been tested, but they had emerged stronger and more united. The mission was complete, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. They had faced adversity with courage and determination, and they had triumphed against the odds. As the night wore on and the fire's glow flickered in the darkness, Steve looked at his friends with a sense of pride and gratitude. They had accomplished something truly extraordinary, and their story would be remembered for years to come. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had ultimately led them to a place of triumph and hope. With the relic neutralized and their world safe, they were ready to face whatever new adventures awaited them, knowing that they could overcome any challenge as long as they stood together. Their tale was one of bravery, friendship, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that the bonds they had forged and the lessons they had learned would guide them in whatever lay ahead.